Based on what new South Carolina baseball coach Paul Mainieri said at his introductory press conference on Thursday, the Gamecocks are going to be a much more aggressive and well-rounded team in 2025.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Antwane, the host of this podcast, and I thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both wherever you get your audio podcasts daily and also on YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Happy Friday to Gamecock Nation. Hope that you've all had a great week. We're going to talk about a couple of things on this edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Later on in the show, I'll be joined by Locked On Ole Miss host Steven Willis to talk about where the Rebels are at this point in the offseason, what they're expecting in 2024, and how the game is shaping up between South Carolina and Ole Miss. We'll dive into all the storylines, including Juice Wells, related to that game later on in the show. But to start off today's show, I want to talk about the Gamecocks' new baseball coach, who was introduced to Gamecock Nation on Thursday afternoon, and former LSU head coach and national championship winning coach Paul Mainieri. And obviously, a lot was said during that press conference. And I know that depending on the fan that you ask, there were probably some different things that you were looking to see Paul Mainieri address. But I do know this. The one common denominator between most fans when looking at that press conference that they want to know is, what is the team going to look like? What should we expect from South Carolina on the field starting with this next season? And the main takeaway that you should have is this. Paul Mainieri wants to field a team that can put pressure on their opponent in a variety of different ways. So here are some of the things that Paul Mainieri specifically mentioned in his press conference on Thursday afternoon. We're going to be a good base running team. I think that's important to note because that was the very first thing that came out of his mouth. He said that he wants to be able to utilize hit and runs. He understands that depending on the coach that you watch, some teams don't use the idea of hit and runs anymore in baseball. But he's going to, as he put it, bring it back out of the closet. He does want to have a few power hitters. So maybe not have an entire lineup that's loaded with them, but he wants at least a few guys where, hey, if there's runners on base or, you throw them a really bad pitch, they're going to make you pay more often than not. He also wants a team that can handle the bat pretty well and some guys that are going to be able to bunt. So obviously Gamecock Nation saw a little bit of that more in 2024 than they did in 2023. You're going to probably continue to see that in 2025. He wants a team that's not going to strike out very often. So he wants a team that's going to be disciplined at the plate. Here's another thing that he mentioned, and something that I really think, along with the base running, is a thing that fans should note about Paul Mainieri. He wants his team to be a good defensive team. And it's not just the fact that he said that, but it's the fact that he also said he's going to coach the infield himself. So clearly, this is something that Paul Mainieri heavily prioritizes with his programs. And he also mentioned that, look, you can't be a great pitching team if you do not have a good defense behind you. And it makes a lot of sense because, especially with the technology usage that players have at their disposal these days, it's a lot more difficult than it ever has been to get really good hitters out. So you got to have some guys behind your pitching mound that are going to be able to make some plays that other teams might not be able to make. He's not big on walking more than everybody else. He wants to give his batters the green light. Now, obviously, I would imagine that also means he wants his batters to be able to find a way to get ahead in the count. But also, if you go behind 2-0, or not behind 2-0, but if the batter has a 2-0 advantage in the count over the pitcher, or maybe even like a 3-0 or 3-1, He wants to let them swing from their heels, as he put it. So he wants his batters to go up there with confidence and feeling like that, hey, they're in control, not the pitcher and the catcher. And then lastly, he wants pitchers that are going to attack the strike zone or not get behind in the count. So he did say specifically when it comes to balancing, hey, the eyeball test and analytics, that he is not married to one philosophy or another. He is going to utilize both. He said that he'd be crazy to not use certain data points to help give him a better idea of what kind of team he's got, what kind of players he has. But also, depending on the situation, he is going to have a gut feeling that he is going to trust. And obviously, Paul Mainieri has been very successful doing it that way for a very, very long time. So as far as how he's going to run his program and what he expects out of his guys, I don't think Paul Mainieri could have gave a more in-depth answer in that regard. And I know that I listed a bunch of things off there, and you're probably, might have your head spinning a little bit. But the point here is this. Every single one of those things that Paul Mainieri mentioned wants to be a good base running team, wants to have a good defensive team, wants batters to be aggressive when they're in hitter counts, wants pitchers to attack the strike zone. All these things culminate and put a ton of pressure on the opposing team. This is kind of what South Carolina was when they went through their run in the early part of the previous decade, when they won those back-to-back national championships, made it to the College World Series finals 3 years in a row. South Carolina, the reason that they had the success they had was because, quite frankly, they excelled in almost every area. Yes, they had some really good pitchers, and yes, they had a couple of hitters that could knock the ball out of any ballpark. But South Carolina was a well-rounded team, and they found a way to win in a variety of ways, whether it was a shootout in baseball terms or it was a low-scoring extra innings type of ball game. South Carolina found a way to win more often than not, and that's what Paul Mainieri wants. He wants a team that is not married to just one specific philosophy and come hell or high water, win or lose, they're going to stick with it. He wants a team that can be flexible as far as their skill sets are concerned. The team that I think about when he mentions all this stuff is Kentucky. Think about it. Kentucky does not have one specific batter on that team that gets the notoriety of, say, an Ethan Petrie or a Charlie Condon or Jack Caglione from Florida. They don't have like that one guy. They've got a couple solid power hitters, but they don't have that one dude that is like nationally known. They don't have maybe an ace pitcher that can pretty much put any batting lineup down in order. But Kentucky's a well-rounded team. They can hit for power in certain spots. They also clearly can steal bases. They have no problem with taking extra bases. And they're a really good defensive team. And guess what? That approach has gotten Kentucky to the Super Regional round 2 years in a row. And this year, they're in Omaha. They're a part of the Final Eight, battling for a national championship. They've never done that before in their school history. So I am excited about what Paul Mainieri said on Thursday. I know the Gamecock baseball fans are probably all fired up. And if this is any indication, if this team truly lives up to what Paul Mainieri said he wants them to be on Thursday, a lot of the head-scratching plays and sometimes head-scratching decisions that were made at the top in 2024, I don't think you're going to see a repeat of that in 2025. I don't think you're going to see a repeat of that at all. So very excited to see what the Yardcocks are going to be able to do in 2025. But at the same time, we've got football we're looking forward to this summer as we're in the midst of talking season. I've had multiple other Locked On hosts on in recent shows to talk about the upcoming game between South Carolina and that respective opponent. And today, we're going to be joined by a Locked On Ole Miss host, Steve Willis, to talk about the Gamecocks' fall matchup with the Rebels. We'll talk about that game and some of the bigger storylines coming into that matchup in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier than before. prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets. Game 4 is taking place later tonight between the Boston Celtics and the Dallas Mavericks, with the Mavericks trying to stave off being swept here in Game 4. They are, of course, hosting this game, and because of the fact that this could indeed be the final game of the NBA Finals, tickets have dropped a little bit. The cheapest ticket you can get right now at American Airlines Center is $472. So if you're in the state of Texas or close to the Dallas area and you want to go check out a finals game, it might be a good time to do so. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen, wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your first watch on YouTube. We're going to continue to do some season previews on today's show, as South Carolina got a very intriguing game this upcoming season with the Ole Miss Rebels. So to talk about this game a little bit more, I'm going to be chatting here with Locked On Ole Miss host Steven Willis. You can find all of his stuff with Locked On Ole Miss on YouTube, wherever you get your audio podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. I believe Steven Willis even has a TikTok as well, so he's always pumping out content over on these social media platforms. Steven, how you doing today?
I am doing quite well, man, Andrew. It's nice to join you on the show to talk a little bit about Juice Wells. No, I'm kidding.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of intriguing aspects, Stephen, about this game. It's the first time I think the Gamecocks and Rebels have played since 2020, the COVID season. And honestly, that was the game that pretty much sealed Will Muschamp's fate here in Columbia, as they lost a absolute barn burner. Oh, yeah, that was absolutely the clipboard game. So you know that clip's going to get played a lot, previewing that game as it approaches. But, Steven, you mentioned it earlier, so let's just go ahead and get right into it. Antwane Juice Wells, former wide receiver at South Carolina, decides to enter the portal this offseason, goes over to Ole Miss to join up with Jackson Dart in this Lane Kiffin offense. And obviously some hard feelings on South Carolina's end, some mixed stories depending on who you ask. Some South Carolina fans might say Juice Wells could have played and chose not to. Some other people might say, hey, Juice Wells had a much worse injury than people outside of both buildings realize. So, Steven, going into this game, who do you think is going to have more incentive to win? Do you think it's going to be South Carolina, maybe the fan base and how rowdy they get? Or do you think it's going to be Antwane Juice Wells with all the stuff he's heard over the past few months?
I think it's going to be Juice Wells, honestly, because the rumor that got started about how Juice Wells just chose not to play and all of that narrative that happened. Well, as soon as he transferred to Ole Miss, he ended up having surgery, which means he actually was injured. So South Carolina fans understand that he was not faking it. He had to be injured. He was completely shut down for spring practice at Ole Miss, and he might be ready by mid-June or mid to late June to participate in summer workouts. So it's not a situation where Juice was faking it. Although if the rumors are true to where he was booed at his graduation, that's kind of an interesting type situation that probably is not the best of looks for South Carolina.
No, certainly not. And there were definitely a lot of Gamecock fans that I can't say that did happen. And there were a lot of Gamecock fans that were against that, obviously, because graduation, one of the biggest moments of the young man's life. And, some people let their emotions get the best of them, but definitely going to lead to, I think, a lot of intensity between both sides going to that game. And Steven, honestly, when it comes to the player aspect of this, I think sometimes people overblow, how the players might go up against one another. I don't think South Carolina players are going to have a bunch of hatred towards Juice Wells coming into this game. And I think you could say the same thing about Antwane. So certainly the biggest storyline from an in-game standpoint. But when you look at this game, Steven, from a bird's eye view, the schedule dynamic.
Real quick also, before we move on, I did a little short, I don't know, a couple months back where I interviewed Juice Wells. Juice Wells came on the show and talked about that. And he had a little soundbite that sounded like that he was taking a shot at South Carolina's quarterback, and he wasn't. He wasn't doing that. He was just talking about that he had a chance to go play for Jackson Dart, who was going into his third year of school, and he was propping him up a little bit more than taking a shot at the South Carolina quarterback. And I think it blew up in that Palmetto State, and it's like, good grief, my tweet absolutely went nuts about that. And that's when I was like, okay, this Juice Wells thing going back to South Carolina, it's got a little bit of juice to it. No pun intended.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And of course, that quarterback you're referring to is South Carolina quarterback Lenore Sellers, taking over for Spencer Rattler, who has now moved on to the NFL. Now, Steven, looking at this game from a 30,000-foot view, the schedule dynamic, I think, is quite interesting. South Carolina got a really early bye week. And of course, this year, every team in the SEC's got 2 bye weeks. South Carolina's first one will be the week before this game against Ole Miss. And then they got to go on the road and play Kalen DeBoer and the Alabama Crimson Tide after this game against the Rebels. And then for Ole Miss, they got to play Kentucky at home the week prior. Certainly more talented than Kentucky, but the Wildcats are pretty physical. That's their style of football. And then they got to go on the road to play LSU the following week. And plus, this game is a flex game, which means that from a TV standpoint, it's going to take place sometime between 3:30 to 8 o'clock. At least that's when the game is set to kick off. So how do you feel about the schedule dynamic aspect, Steven? Do you think it favors one team or the other? Or do you think it's about dead even in that regard?
I think it's the talent on the field. Ole Miss is going to be the more talented football team in this game. No, they just are. But the schedule dynamics is definitely in favor of South Carolina. So if they flex it and it's a night game, I've had Bill Flowers on my show. I've had another former player on the show, and they all said the most difficult place that they played was Williams-Brice Stadium. And that's weird coming from an Ole Miss player talking about that, because they don't play that often. So whenever an Ole Miss player says that, your ears kind of perk up a little bit. So a night game, there's obviously going to be flashbacks in Ole Miss fans of the 2009 game. I guess that was the arrival of South Carolina onto the scene, and Ole Miss losing the game in Williams-Brice. But talent on the field, Ole Miss should have the significantly more talented team. So the schedule dynamics help South Carolina out quite a bit. Now, the other thing that is going to help South Carolina out a bit is the next week, I believe Ole Miss takes on LSU. And that will be the first of 2 games that are severely looked at by outsiders at Ole Miss. Everybody is going to be pointing at those games, and that LSU game is going to get a lot of attention. So there's a chance for a sandwich game type effect, even at Williams-Brice. So there are things that could make this tricky for Ole Miss. But if Ole Miss goes to the South Carolina game and plays clean, they do the stuff, they don't do anything crazy. They don't give up explosive plays. They should win the game, but you can see how this game could go sideways on them.
Right. And that's the beauty about the SEC. Certainly every week you got some obvious, talent disadvantages that some teams are at, but, home environments and home crowds, they can make up for that. And obviously the trap game sort of deal as well. Now, talking about the players in this game, once again, Steven, let's go to Jackson Dart. Obviously the starting quarterback for Ole Miss. Jackson Dart, I would say, is obviously a preseason Heisman Trophy contender coming into this year, going to his 3rd year as the starter over there in Oxford. And 2023 was a really good year for Jackson Dart. I believe he threw 23 touchdowns compared to 5 interceptions. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But his road stats they're not quite as good as his home stats. He completed just 59.6% of his passes in 5 road games this past fall, and he had a touchdown to interception ratio of 1.75, only throwing 1 interception at home the entire season. So when you look at all the hype, you look at the Juice Wells situation and the schedule dynamic aspect, combining all of that and putting it on the shoulders of Jackson Dart, Steven, does it concern Rebel fans a little bit that, hey, this could be a game where Dart maybe has a couple costly turnovers, or do you think this will be a different Jackson Dart coming into this season?
I don't think you can make too much of his road splits last year because 2 of the games that he had to play was at Georgia and at Alabama.
That's fair.
Yeah, and so that was going to affect the splits overall with what happened. So Jackson Dart going against Penn State in the Peach Bowl was absolutely nails. He looked like a top 5 quarterback in the country. And I like to compare Jackson Dart, like, where would he be on the Mount Rushmore of Ole Miss quarterbacks after this season? And if Jackson Dart makes a playoff game, he goes to the tippity top. He passes Eli Manning. He passes Archie Manning. I think Jackson Dart is analogous, and you guys, you South Carolina fans, probably understand this more than anything. He kind of has a little Connor Shaw in him. He just wins football games. He won 11 games a year ago. He had a little bit of struggle at the end of the year when Lane Kiffin to Auburn and all of that stuff was going on as a sophomore. If he wins 11, 12 games against this season, I'm telling you, in the pantheon of Ole Miss football, Jackson Dart has a chance to completely stand alone.
Yeah, and certainly would be great company being alongside Archie Manning and Eli Manning. Obviously, the Manning family carries a lot of weight when it comes to the sport of football. So if Jackson Dart can accomplish that, I would say he would have had a great season down there in Oxford. And with great seasons, Ole Miss expectations have changed down there in Mississippi. So when we come back in just a couple moments, Steven Willis and I will discuss what could Ole Miss accomplish this upcoming season. Could the defense catch up to the offense? Could a college football playoff berth be in their midst? We'll touch on all of that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks and the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, where we cover your teams every single day in 30 minutes or less. Steven, let's talk about the Ole Miss Rebels specifically to end today's show. Starting off with Pete Golding. Obviously, big time get for Lane Kiffin on his coaching staff this past offseason. And the Rebels, I would say they were pretty good bend but don't break defense this past year. But obviously, against, again, teams like Georgia and Alabama, which would have been the case for most teams, they did struggle a little bit. But you bring in some big time talent on that side of the ball, specifically Walter Nolan from Texas A&M and Princely from Florida. Not going to try to pronounce the last name. Not going to do it. I'll get ripped up for it on my end. But you bring in those two guys, and it feels like that this could be the season where Ole Miss, they see maybe that shark defense come back in Oxford. The defense finally catches up to Lane Kiffin's offense. Do you think that's going to be the case?
I really do. I think the defense is going to be a surprise because last season, Ole Miss won 11 football games last year. Pete Golding's defense feasted on mid to bad offenses last season. If you were a mid to bad offense, you had no chance. Like Penn State, Arkansas, Vanderbilt, they had no chance to really be successful. Now, if you had a really good offense like LSU, like Alabama, like Georgia, that was a little bit of a different story. And you saw Pete Golding addressing the fact that, hey, we had trouble matching up with those NFL wide receivers and those NFL offensive linemen. So we need to kind of hit the portal. And so Pete Golding went out and got a Walter Nolan. He got a Princely Emmanuel. He got a Chris Pupal from Arkansas. You look at the secondary, they got a couple of really man coverage stalwart players in Trey Amos and Isaiah Hamilton that is going to lock up with the pressure that this defensive line and this front seven is going to provide. You needed some ball hawks back in the back. And then they got some safeties with Key Lawrence and Yam Banks and Lewis Moore, who has a chance to be an under the radar type player, to go with John Saunders is returning and Trey Washington. And this defense has a chance to be good. And so what you're probably going to see, everybody remembers the Ole Miss LSU game from a year ago, to where it was just up and down the field, to where, the score was just completely outrageous. It's one of the best football games I've ever seen in my life. But LSU had the ball in the air to win the game. And this year, the idea is that's a 2-touchdown game. That ball doesn't matter in the air. The offense is just as good as it was a year ago, if not better. The defense has a chance to at least be a top 20 unit in the entire country.
Right. And by the way, I said shark defense earlier. I mean land shark defense. So forgive me, Ole Miss fans, if you're upset about that. But looking at the entire season as a whole, Steven, it feels like that this upcoming season is the culmination of years of work, years of adjustment, and years of adapting and evolving from Lane Kiffin and this entire Rebel football program. There are a lot of people that legitimately expect Ole Miss to compete for a national championship this year. And I got to be honest with you, I cannot remember the last time where that was the case. Maybe the early part of the previous decade, but it's been a minute, to say the least. Do you think that this is the Rebel team that can finally break through, that can make it to the college football playoff, especially now the fact that 12 teams are going to be playing in it?
Yes, I do think that Ole Miss can make the playoff. In fact, I will go a little bit further. I think the bare minimum for an acceptable season that is not a failure is making the playoff for Ole Miss this year. They're completely all in on it. There's 50-something players on this roster that after the season is done, they're gone. So there's going to be a lot of turnover in 2025. The Grove Collective, all of that, it is completely do or die for Ole Miss football. So Lane Kiffin, I think the bare minimum is to make the playoff. I think Ole Miss needs to host a playoff game at a minimum. If you want a good season or a great season, if you want all of the accolades this season is supposed to have, give me Ole Miss versus Notre Dame in Vaught-Hemingway Stadium in mid-December. Give me Ole Miss versus Michigan in Vaught-Hemingway Stadium in December 20-something, whatever it is. I think at that point, you're playing with house money. But one step below it, just making the playoff is just kind of like, okay, it's fine, meh. And if you don't make the playoff, the season is a failure.
Just out of curiosity, Steven, I want to go off of the hypothetical you just threw out there, wanting to host a playoff game. What do you think that would do for the entire community over there in Oxford, the entire state of Mississippi?
Oxford, Mississippi would be the largest city in the state of Mississippi that day. There would be 500,000 people in the Grove. It would be absolutely nuts. The most ridiculous that I've seen the Grove look like was in 2012 when Texas came to the Grove. And all of their fans came with it because they wanted to experience that. There was probably 250,000 people that day. If Ole Miss hosts a playoff game, it'll be the biggest game in the state of Mississippi. In the whole history of it, there'll be 500,000 people in that town that has 25,000 people in it. And the atmosphere and everything surrounding that game would be something Mississippi's never seen.
Ole Miss definitely one of the biggest teams to watch this upcoming season, and South Carolina's matchup against them certainly one of the most intriguing for Gamecock fans, not just because of Juice Wells, but because of the kind of game it could be when both of those teams face off later on this fall. Steven Willis, thank you so much for coming on to today's show. For all you Locked On Gamecock viewers and listeners, and all you Locked On Rebel viewers and listeners, Locked On Ole Miss, thank y'all for tuning in as well. Y'all have a great rest of your day. We'll be sure to catch y'all on our next respective show on Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Ole Miss.